Okay, so I'm going to do the sort of the usual, tell you a little bit about PLOS if you don't already know what we're doing in terms of the taxonomy. And then the application example for today is the fate predictor, or internally we generally just call it the triage project, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. Who are we? This is who we are. We get a lot of submissions per month, especially for PLOS 1. We have 7 different journals. Jonas and I are based in San Francisco. Rachel is based in the UK. And we have been self-sustaining, paying for our way since late 2010. These are our journals. And I want to talk a little bit about PLOS 1 because that's really where this fate predictor comes into play. The editorial criteria for PLOS 1 are a little bit different from most journals, and so that causes a lot of, well, it causes a lot of the volume that comes in and a lot of the volume that goes out the other end. So we publish a lot, and we get a lot of papers in because our editorial criteria do not include things like, how important is this? So in a lot of journals, and other journals I've worked on certainly, the rejection rate is high, acceptance is low, and when the editor looks at a paper, they go, oh, this is sort of boring. Or someone's already done something sort of like this, or it really doesn't drive the field forward in some huge way, or we're not going to get any real attention for publishing this. And so they reject things like that. And at PLOS 1, we don't. We just want to make sure that the research has been done properly, even if the results are negative, and that everything that is done well deserves to be published. And so the journal is quite large. Okay, so we built a multidisciplinary taxonomy working with AI, and it is actively maintained and updated by a very dedicated FTE, Rachel. She'll tell you she's dedicated. She is. So we index things in a couple of different ways. We index every manuscript as it comes into the submission system. We index on the other end too, when the paper's been accepted and ready for publication. We index again. And then we index our academic editors, and we'll explain a little bit about that. And actually, Jonas will talk more about that. It's just sort of a little bit separate from what I'm going to talk about, but we do index the editors. We gather information about them, and we classify them, so we know who they are and what are their areas of study. I talked about these last year, so I'm not going to talk about them today. But this submission fate analysis for PLOS 1 is really an internal decision support system, or it will be when it's working. It's basically to help us know what's coming in and where could it go. And I'll talk a little bit about why it is we think we need to do this, why it is we really do need to do this. And the main question is this, how do we identify papers early in the process that might need special attention? And in the larger picture, we'd like to have at least 3 tracks for papers. One that's sort of the green light track, which is fast track. We know this person, we know who they are, they've published with us before, we're not going to have any problems with this paper, let's push it forward. We've got the sort of the red light track, which is this paper looks like it's going to be a problem for any number of reasons, and it still might get accepted, but it might have trouble getting through the analysis and evaluation process. So we might triage those and send them down a different path so that we can deal with them quickly and they don't sit around in other parts of the process. And then sort of the middle track, which most papers will fit into, where they work nicely through the process that we have developed. And these are the kind of things in smaller journals. The editor gets manuscripts in and they look at them and they say, yeah, I know what to do with this. But when you're getting 200 and more manuscripts each day, that's hard to keep up with. And so, most of the challenges and issues that we have with PLOS 1 are just due to volume. It's really no different from any other journal except for the volume. And that's a real challenge. So our initial concentration for the project is on manuscripts that are likely to be rejected or those that might take a really long time to get through the system. And as any scientist or other researcher would tell you, when they submit a paper to a journal, they just want to know quickly, are you going to reject it? Fine, do it, and let me move on to the next journal. And so one of the issues that we have sometimes is that the papers that have a problem getting through take a long time, and then we reject them. So we want to be able to find those early and shuffle them off to maybe an editor who is, is going to look at those kinds of papers, whatever they are, and just do something with them, make a judgment, send them out to an academic editor who's external to our own staff, and move quickly on those things so that you don't get stuck and people don't get angry, which they do. Okay, so what are we looking at? We thought, what are the characteristics that are going to be predictive? What's going to help us determine where something's going to go and how long it'll take? And so we pulled some files with information, and then we also had Access Innovations run the papers through the taxonomy engine. Part of that was because we looked both at accepted papers and rejected papers. Accepted papers have taxonomic terms in them, and rejected papers didn't. So we were trying to get them to be a little bit equal. But we also looked at, who the authors were, what institutions they were from, what country, manuscript information, just like the text of title and abstract, financial disclosures, who are their funders, because they have a funder, conflicts of interest, what is the author saying about their conflicts or lack thereof. And then we also had, for rejected papers, the text, the actual text of the decision letter, which we thought might be helpful in some way. But the idea was, what's the combination that's going to work for us? So that's our aspiration here, is can we take all that data and say, from the accepted papers and the rejected papers, what combination of factors would tell us which bucket any paper might go into? So that when something comes into the system, even before we do our technical checks or anything else on those papers, we would be able to say, this is likely to have a problem because it's from this particular institution in this particular country, and the paper doesn't have any funding information, and any combination of things, or it's in a particular subject area. What is it that's going to tell us that? It sounded like a good idea. It's sort of difficult to do this, though. This is what we've found. So we're hoping that we can find these things. Where are the problem papers? What can we do with them? And then we build a workflow that takes them into account. I want to make sure, it's because I've done this talk in places where they just thought, oh, so you find those papers and you just reject them. Oh, no, that's not the idea here. It's to deal with them effectively and efficiently so that those authors aren't waiting 4, 6, 8 weeks for some sort of a decision because we haven't been able to identify an academic editor to handle the paper, or because we've had to send it back to the author because it had, ethical issues that the author had to deal with. So that's the goal of this, to get to these more effective and efficient workflows. So as I said, we were trying to take the combination of bibliographic data, things about this manuscript, and also the taxonomic data, which tells us what is it about. And we do have a whole section of the thesaurus that deals with research methods. So it might be able to tell us a little bit about what what kinds of methodologies were used or not used for particular kinds of areas. And we started out with 2 years worth of data, 2 years worth of accepted articles, 2 years worth of rejected articles. And on PLOS One, that is a lot of data. And so one of the things we've had problems with is we've worked with a couple of different groups to sort of, have them help us to do this kind of analysis, and it's too big for an Excel spreadsheet. And pivot tables don't really help. And the data's not clean. So we look at things like funding. We've just started using the FundRef kind of application within Editorial Manager. We've just started using some institutional standardization, but for all of these papers, we don't have that. So how do you pull that information together and say, well, it might be easy for Harvard and Yale and places like that, but it's not going to be easy for smaller institutions in other countries where the authors may be presenting the data in native language of the country, in English, some combination. It's going to be really difficult to nail those things down. So that's something that's really held us back as well. And what have we learned so far? I have to say, this is not saving us thousands of hours. Yeah. The one thing that we learned was that single-authored manuscripts just don't make it. It's sort of interesting, but it also sometimes depends on what country they're from. We also know that we have higher than average rejection rates for meta-analyses, especially things like GWAS studies, where people just pull a bunch of data together and throw it at something and say, oh yeah, well we can find these things about it. Those are usually done fairly badly. Randomized controlled trials, everybody wants to get in the act there. And surgical papers and other kinds of invasive medical applications usually don't do well, especially from certain countries. But those three things, we already knew those. We already tagged those when they come into the system, and we track them separately. So we're already doing that kind of a triage for those three types of papers. So I think we need some really serious multidimensional analysis, not a spreadsheet. And I don't know where to find that yet, but I am working on it. And the idea would be that once we have something like this, and maybe we build it over time, it might be a small amount of data first, and then as we get more experience, we would build on that and keep leveraging that for more and more types of things. And the better that our own metadata gets, the easier this will be to do. Once we have good, standardized institutional names, standardized funders, things like that, it will make a huge difference. Okay, I talked really fast. Maybe it was those 2 chocolate brownies I had, and I wanted to make sure I didn't fall asleep. So, questions? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So, the rejected manuscripts, do you know, did they ever get published? Did they go somewhere? Are these truly so bad that...
We have done some studies on that. Some of them do end up going places. And we've also done author surveys where we've asked people, if you were rejected, where did you go next? So we know what journals they went to. But it's fairly easy to just do a search and find where they were published. If you're really interested in publishing, you'll find a place, whether it's another open access journal or some other kind of journal. Even for PLOS One, if it doesn't make it, hopefully we've given people enough feedback that they know how to make their paper better, and then they'll go somewhere else to publish it.
But I would assume that some articles, obviously editors get it wrong. And when And all indication says that this article is not worth publishing. The author goes off and publishes it in Nature. And it's,
I
20
can pretty much
citations.
tell you that's not going to happen.
But that was the extreme case. But I'm sure that there are papers that left PLOS and were cited more than 4 or 5 times.
Sure, and where we have about 6,000 academic editors, there's people out in the field who handle papers. We work very hard to train them and get them fully up to date on what the actual criteria are for acceptance or rejection from PLOS 1. They're not always doing that quite the way they should, but we do have programs in place for rejection and acceptance scanning. So we look at those decisions before they go out. And sometimes we pull things back and say, well, this really isn't a reason to reject the paper. This is something that's okay for PLOS 1.
And also, sometimes when you do see one of those articles go on and be published elsewhere, it's very much improved, even though it might have the same title, it might have the same abstract.
Yeah.
By the time it's published elsewhere, it isn't really the same submission.
And there are radically different reasons for rejecting. We have very strict ethical and data availability guidelines. A lot of people won't make data available, so they just find a publisher that doesn't care about data sharing.
Yeah.
And so it might be a great paper that we happily publish, but they don't want to comply with it.
Yeah, no, I think we all have the same problems. The other sort of follow-up to this is with 6,000 editors, how do you deal with the variability between, you're dealing with content from NASA published studies to, aerospace to, deep sea.
Well, and that's
drilling.
one of the issues that we have, and one of the reasons behind doing this is that we have a system that Jonas is going to talk about called PLOS Match, that takes all the papers that come in, and this is why they're indexed and the editors are indexed, is we try to match them to, match an appropriate editor to the incoming papers.
Yeah.
And when we don't have a good number of editors in a particular subject area, it may be that that's a really good paper. We just don't have enough people handling papers. And for that reason, it might take a long time to find an editor to work with that paper. Those are the kinds of things that we also might pull out at the beginning to say, we just don't have enough astronomy folks. And if we see something that looks like a decent astronomy paper, we may pull it out and not put it through the whole process because it's likely to come out at the end still without an editor. So we might give it to somebody directly and say, do you want to handle this? Would you look at it and suggest somebody or something like that?
So in the fate predictor model, do you model for those variabilities, or did you just take it as a one?
It's something we haven't done yet. It's something we haven't done yet, but it is one of the things we would like to do. So it's not just, is it likely to be rejected, but is it likely to take a long time to assign an editor? Because we know that can take a long time. And so those also might get pulled out and go down a different path as well. Any questions? Yeah.
This is sort of an obvious application for the Bayesian classification idea. We probably explored it some. I know I did when I saw this data. Have you any thoughts there?
I think we're still really at the beginning of this. We're just trying to be able to analyze the huge amount of data that we have. And it may be that we just need to focus on very small questions at the beginning and build from there. I guess, at the beginning I thought, these things are all great, and we're just going to get a cross mapping of all of these different types of fields, and we're going to know that it's Chinese authors from this institution writing about medicine are just never going to make it, but Chinese authors from that institution writing in this area will be fine. And it's just not that easy to do this.
Well, what I was thinking in terms of, well, you have, like you say, Chinese authors, there's a certain probability.
Right.
Okay. We index it, and there's a probability associated with each word, and so you end up, and maybe there's other factors like institutions and such. And you start multiplying all those probabilities together and you say, probability of rejection is this, probability of acceptance is that. Okay, this one's probably going to be one or the other. And it's clear cut. Well, how to do that, I don't know how well it works. I actually tried it a little bit, but I'm not sure that, yeah.
So, hold your thoughts, because as a continuation of that, we talked about applying bag of words to related processes. So, any other questions for Helen? Because if there aren't, PLOS show continues.
Okay.